The Mongol intrusions of Japan, 1274 and 1281 CE. The Mongol intrusions of Japan took place in 1274 and 1281 CE when Kublai Khan, R. 1260 to 1294 CE, sent two gigantic armadas from Korea and China. In both cases, the Japanese, and particularly the samurai warriors, enthusiastically protected their shores, but it would be storms and the so-called kamikaze or divine winds which sank and suffocated endless ships and men, hence sparing Japan from remote success. The entirety wonderful scene, which blended divine intercession with military valor, would pick up and hold legendary status in Japanese culture until the end of time after. Diplomatic opening. The Mongols had as of now sucked half of China and Korea into their colossal realm, and their pioneer Kublai Khan presently set his sights on Japan. Kublai was the grandson of Genghis Khan and had established the Yuan tradition of China, 1271 to 1368 CE, with his capital at Dadu, Beijing, but fair why he presently needed to incorporate Japan in his domain is vague. He may have looked for to overcome Japan for its assets. The nation did have a long-standing notoriety in East Asia as a rival gold, a truth described in the West by the Venetian voyager Marco Polo, 1254 to 1324 CE. Kublai Khan may have wished to improve his glory or dispose of the exchange between that nation and his awesome foe in southern China, the Southern Melody tradition, 1125 to 1279 CE. The success of Japan would moreover have brought a modern and well-equipped armed force into Khan's hands, which he may have utilized to great impact against the troublesome Tun. The intrusions may indeed have been a few sort of exact retribution for the devastation that the wacko Japanese privateers had been causing to East Asian coastlines and exchange ships. Anything is reasons, the approach was clear. Discretion to begin with, fighting second. The incredible Khan sent a letter to Japan in 1268 CE, perceiving its pioneer as the King of Japan and communicating a want to cultivate inviting relations, but two requesting tribute be paid to the Mongol court with the inauspiciously hidden risk that the utilize of arms was, the Khan trusted, to be maintained a strategic distance from. A Chinese envoy, Zhao Yangbi, was too sent to Japan in 1270 CE, and he remained there for a year to cultivate a few sort of understanding between the two countries. Encouraged letters and ministers were sent by the Khan up to 1274 CE, but all were obtrusively overlooked as if the Japanese did not very know how to react, and so chosen to sit quietly on the discretionary fence. Latest videos. The Kamakura shogunate had ruled Japan since 1192 CE, and the official shogun Hojo Tokumin, R. 1268 to 1284 CE, was sure he'd see meet any danger from terrain Asia. Troops were put on alarm in the Dazaifu fortification and military base in northwest Kyushu, where any attack appeared most likely to arrive. But the Khan's discretionary approach was rebuked both by the Japanese head and the shogunate. The need of nuance in the Japanese reaction to the Khan's suggestions may have been down to their need of encounter in universal relations after a long period of confinement, and by the inclination of their vital contact with terrain Asia, the southern Tun, and the Mu conclusion banished Chinese and Buddhist ministers had of their Mongol conquerors. To begin with attack, Bunei campaign. The Khan amassed an armada of a few 800 to 900 ships and dispatched it from Korea to Japan in early November 1274 CE. The ships carried an armed force of a few 16,600 to 40,000 men, which comprised the Mongols and recruited Chinese and Koreans. To begin with Japanese region to get these trespassers was Tsushima and Iki Islands on the 5th and the 13th of November separately, which were at that point ravaged. The Mongol assaults had met firm resistance on Tsushima, where protectors were driven by Sosukakuni, but were effective, generally much appreciated to prevalent numbers. The cautious drive at Iki, driven by Terakajitaka, was similarly brave, but they were in the long run obliged to make a final stand inside Heinetsum Castle. When no fortifications came from the terrain, the castle fell. The intruders utilized more energetic front-line procedures, utilizing well-disciplined and skillful cavalry, which reacted to orders passed on by gongs and drums. After a brief halt at Takashima Island and the Matsura landmass, the intrusion armada continued to Hakata Cove, landing on November 19th. The huge bays protected in shallow waters had proposed to the Japanese this would be the correct spot chosen by the Mongol commanders. A range they may have been, but the add-up to Japanese protection constraint was still little. between 4,000 and 6,000 men. The Mongols wanted to begin with engagements, much obliged to their prevalent numbers and weapons. The effective double-horn bow and black powder explosives fired by catapults, and their more energetic war zone methodologies utilizing well-disciplined and skillful cavalry, which reacted to orders passed on by gongs and drums. The Mongols had other compelling weapons as well, such as armor-piercing crossbows and harm bolts. In expansion, the Japanese were not utilized to combat, including mass troop developments, as they favored permitting person warriors to choose their claimed single targets. Or maybe the Japanese warriors worked in little bunches driven by a mounted samurai talented at arrow-based weaponry and a number of defensive infantry, equipped with naginata or curved blade polearm. Another drawback was that the Japanese tended to utilize shields as it were as defensive dividers for toxophilites, whereas the Mongols and the Korean infantry ordinarily carried a shield of their claim as they move around the front line. The samurai did have certain focal points over the adversary, as they wore iron plate and casque and defensive layer, as were the Mongol overwhelming cavalry war shield, and their long, sharp swords were utilized much more successfully than the Mongol brief sword. Inquisitively, 18 days after beginning with landing on Japanese soil, and in spite of making a bridgehead at Hakata Cove, the intruders did not thrust on more profound into Japanese region. Maybe this was since the supply issues of the passing of the Mongol Khamen, Lu Fuxian, murdered by a samurai's bolt. It may moreover be genuine that the entirety invasion was really a surveillance mission for the moment bigger intrusion, however to come, and no success was ever aiming in 1274 CE. Anything the rationale, the intruders remained by their ships for the night, pulling back out into the inlet for security on November 20th. This was a game-changing choice since, in a few accounts, an awful storm at that point struck, which slaughtered up to a third of the Mongol armed force and extremely harmed the armada. The assailants were hence obliged to pull back to Korea. Diplomatic interval. Kublai Khan at that point returned to discretion and sent another international safe haven to Japan in 1275, CE requesting, once more, tribute be paid. This time the shogunate was indeed more pretentious in its answer and decapitated the Mongol envoys on a shoreline close Kamakura. The Khan was resolute and sent a moment international safe haven in 1279 CE. The delivery people met the same destiny as their forerunners, and the Khan figured out as it were constrained would bring Japan into the Mongol realm. Be that as it may, Kublai Khan was involved with campaigns in southern China against the Melody, and it would be two more sometime recently, he turned his consideration once more to Japan. Meanwhile, the Japanese have been anticipating an up-and-coming attack ever since 1274 CE, and this period of tall anticipation made extraordinary scratch in the government's treasury. Separated from keeping the armed force on standby, fortresses were built and enormous stone dividers raised around Hakata Inlet in 1275 CE, which measured a few 19 kilometers, 12 miles, in length and were up to 2.8 meters, 9 feet, tall in places. Planning to allow bowmen on steeds, the inward sides of the Hakata dividers were slanted, whereas external confronting was sheer. If a moment intrusion was to come, Japan was presently much more arranged for it. The moment attack, Koan campaign. Kublai Khan's moment intrusion armada was an entire part greater than to begin with one. This time, much appreciated to his later vanquish of the Tun and securing of their naval force. There were 4,400 ships and around 100,000 men, once more a blend of Mongol, Chinese, and Korean warriors. Once more, the intruders hit Tsushima June 9th and Iki June 14th, sometime recently assaulting Hakata Cove on Kyushu on June 23rd. 1281 CE. This time, in spite of the fact that the constrained part in one armada assaulted Honshu, where it was rebuked at Nagato. In the meantime, at Hakata, the Japanese put their resistances to great utilize and displayed a firm resistance. The fortress dividers did their work, and this time the aggressors might not set up themselves forever on the shoreline, coming about in much shipboard battling. Inevitably, after overwhelming misfortunes, the Mongols pulled back to begin with the Shiga and Noki Islands, and at that point to Iki Island. There they were annoyed by Japanese ships making steady attacks, and the Mongol armada utilizing little vessels and much boldness. Numerous of the afterward stories of samurai heroics come from this scene of the invasion. On 14 Eminent, a tropical storm devastated most of the Mongol armada, destroying ships that had been tied together for security against Japanese raids. The Khan at that point dispatched fortifications from southern China, maybe another 40,000 men. A few sources go as tall as 100,000. And the two armed forces accumulated to make combined thrust more profound into Japanese domain, this time selecting Hirado as the target in early Admirable. The combined armadas at that point moved east and assaulted Tokushima. The fight there taking put on August 12th. Fierce battling seethed for a few weeks, and the intruders likely confronted deficiencies of supplies. At that point, however, once more, the climate mediated and caused ruin. On 14 Admirable, a tropical storm annihilated most of the Mongol armada, destroying ships that had been tied together for security against Japanese strikes and crushing the wild vessels against the coastline. From half to two-thirds of the Mongol constraint was slaughtered. Thousands more of the Khan's men were washed up or cleared out stranded on the shorelines of Amari Narrows, and these were summarily executed, in spite of the fact that a few Melody Chinese, previous partners of Japan, were saved. Those ships that survived cruised back to China. The storm winds that either sunk or blew the Mongol ships securely absent from Japanese shores were given the title kamikaze or divine winds, as they were seen as a reaction to the Japanese request of Hachiman, the Shinto god of war, to send offer assistance to secure the nation against an endlessly numerically prevalent adversary. The title kamikaze would be revived for the Japanese suicide pilots of the moment World War, 1939 to 1945 CE, as they as well were seen as a final resort to once more spare Japan from invasion. The Cambridge History of Japan, Volume 3, Medieval Japan. It appears as well that the Mongol ships were not especially well built and so demonstrated much less secure than they ought to have been. Advanced marine archaic exploration has uncovered that numerous of the ships had particularly powerless pole steps, which is something completely not to have in the case of storm. The destitute workmanship may have been due to Kublai Khan surging to get the intrusion armada together, as numerous of the ships in the armada were of assortment without, a bottom and profoundly unacceptable for ocean voyages. Advance. Chinese ships of the period were really eminent for their seaworthiness, so it appears a request for a gigantic armada in a brief space of time brought about in a chance that did not pay off. All things considered, the pivotal calculate in the fleet's death was the Japanese assaults, which had constrained the Mongol commanders to have their expansive and clumsy ships lashed together utilizing chains. It was this cautious degree which demonstrated deadly. Come the typhoon. Aftermath. The Mongols would too come up short in their endeavors to overcome Vietnam and Java, but after 1281 CE, they did at that point build up enduring peace over most of Asia, the Pax Mongolica, which would persevere until the rise of the Ming line, 1368 to 1644 CE. Kublai Khan never gave up on the political course either, and proceeded to send unsuccessful missions to induce Japan to connect the Chinese tribute system. The Japanese, in the meantime, may have seen off the two intrusions they called Moko Shurai, but they completely anticipated a third to come at any time, and so kept an armed force in steady status for the another 30 a long time. Luckily for them, the Mongols had other challenges to confront along the borders of their enormous realm, and there would be no third time fortunate in the endeavor to overcome Japan. The extraordinary centrality of the intrusions to the Japanese individuals is here outlined by the student of history M. Ashkenazi. For the Japanese of the 13th century, the undermined Mongol intrusion was, generally and politically, a major watershed. It was to begin with time, the whole military might of Japan had to be mobilized for resistance of the country. Until at that point, indeed outside wars were small more than quarrels that included one or another group inside Japan, basically residential issues. With the Mongol attack, Japan got to be uncovered to universal legislative issues at individual and national level as never some time recently, 188 to 9. The Buddhist ministers and Shinto clerics who had long been promising divine mediation were demonstrated right when the storms devastated the Mongol armadas, and this come about an upsurge in both religions' notoriety. One zone of life where the attacks are inquisitively truant is in Japanese medieval writing, but there is one popular scroll portraying the intrusion, commissioned by a samurai warrior who battled amid the attack, Takazuki Suwanaga. It is known as the Mongol scroll Moko Shirai Kotoba, and was delivered in 1293 CE to advance Takazuki's possessed part in the battle, unfortunately for the Japanese government. In spite of the fact that the viable cost of the attacks would have genuine results, an armed force had to be kept in steady preparation. Hakuto was kept on caution with a standing armed force until 1312 CE. An installment of warriors got to be a genuine issue driving the far-reaching discontent. This was a war of guard, not success, and there were no ruins of warlike booty and arrived to remunerate the warriors. The rural division was too seriously disturbed by the protection arrangements. Rivals to the Hojo clan, who ruled the Kamakura shogunate, started to plan their challenge to the political status quo. Sovereign Go-Daigo are 1318 to 1339 CE, enthusiastic for the heads to recapture a few of their long-lost political control, blended up a disobedience which come about in the possible drop of the Kamakura shogunate in 1333 CE and the establishment of the Ashikaga shogunate, 1338 to 1573 CE. This will begin with Shogun Ashikaga Takauji R, 1338 to 1358 CE.